Checking all your arrows in detail, individually, is something you should do throughout the whole year. You can do it after every few shooting sessions, ideally, but at the bare minimum, you need to do it before you go hunting. You should do it after a hunt, and you should do it after really long shooting sessions. If you're shooting 3D, if you're shooting groups and your arrows have been slapping each other all day, it's often not obvious at all at first glance that there could be something wrong with your arrow, and it could cost you a shot, and it actually can be dangerous. So I'm gonna break down exactly how I inspect each of my arrows, and I'm gonna show you where the common fault points are that can render an arrow unusable, or you realize something at least needs to be fixed on it. So I'm going to break it all down. So one thing you're going to need that's super important is an arrow spinner. They're very cheap, but I recommend getting a higher quality one. I mean, at most you should be paying 50, 60 bucks for one. I might stay away from a $10 one, but this is something that you buy once, you buy it for life, and it will quickly become one of the most used tools you have in archery. This one's from Nock. I love it. I have a few different arrows here. These are all just arrows I found in my old arrow bin. When an arrow gets retired, I have a bin I keep them all in, and I don't really tend to throw any arrows out. So I just got a few here that'll show you some different things I look for in an arrow and expose some flaws that you might come across. And the other thing you're going to need is a perfect broadhead, a broadhead that you know is going to spin perfectly. This is a fresh out of the package, 150 grain tooth of the arrow XL, solid. So this is going to spin perfect, and it's going to be crucial in assessing all my arrows here. So what we're looking for here is any flaw in the arrow that's going to cause it to not fly correctly. Now from the front to the back of the arrow, there's a lot of places that there can be issues, but the first thing you want to do is just screw a broadhead on and put it on the spinner. The very first thing you're going to look for is wobble in the tip. So you can see that this spins really well. What this tells me is that the carbon itself is not bent, which is something that can happen. The insert is still fine, and of course, my broadhead is still square. Now this arrow, it seems good to go, but there's one more thing I want to check on it, and that's the back end. Oftentimes when you're shooting groups and arrows are hitting each other, nocks can get hit and they can bend. So one thing I'm going to do is just press back and forth both ways on that nock and make sure it doesn't have any bend or movement. When these get hit and they develop a breakage inside, sometimes you can't see it, but when you go and do that push and pull on the nock, you might find this. Here's one that I know I hit, and this will happen. Pops right off as soon as I push on it. Now what happened is this arrow was hit by another arrow, and I could see it had a slight bend in it, so I knew that this one was going to break. But it was just a small enough bend that I might not have seen it if I wasn't inspecting each arrow individually. So I'll always do that and go and check each nock when I'm inspecting. So now I know that this arrow has no bend anywhere in the carbon or in the front end, and that my nock is good. Now what happens if I put an arrow on and it does this? I mean, this is an absurdly poor spinning arrow, but obviously this is not going to shoot well. So let's figure out where the issue is. First thing I'll do is I'll look straight down the arrow shaft. If you look down this one, you can see that that front is bent. That's because this is an aluminum insert. I talked about this type of insert in a recent video. You can go check out my All About Inserts video. Having a pure aluminum component on the end of your arrow is begging for something like this to happen. With this arrow, by looking straight down the arrow, and I can clearly see it's the insert that's bent, that tells you everything you need to know. That is why this arrow is spinning like crazy. But what if I were to look down my arrow shaft and see that the insert looks totally fine and perfectly straight as I spin it, but it's still wobbling? Well, what that can tell you is that the carbon itself is bent. Now, this is not super common with all carbon arrows, but if you're shooting any arrow that has aluminum in it, a full metal jacket, for example, they are notorious for bending over time. What you'll do is you'll look straight down your arrow again, but this time from the nock, and just spin it, and you should be able to see if there's any bend in the arrow at all. Now this one, we know that the shaft is perfectly straight and that the issue is in the insert. But here, I've got an old full metal jacket. This is from my muskox hunt like 8 years ago. you can clearly see that that arrow is bent. That's because this is an aluminum jacket over a carbon arrow, and aluminum bends. So you can see here how wobble on the front end of your arrow could come either from a component that's been bent at the front or the arrow itself. But the common denominator with all this stuff is aluminum. Aluminum bends, and I try to stay away from it as much as possible. So we know that this arrow's front end is basically junk, and honestly, unless you used hot melt, there's no way to get that insert off and replace it. This arrow is toast. I'll throw it in my old arrow bin, and maybe one day I'll cut it down and use it for a kid's arrow or something. But for my purposes, this arrow is toast. Now, what happens if you have just a little bit of an issue with an arrow spin? This arrow spins pretty good, but it's not perfect. And if you were building your own arrows and squaring them and checking for spin before gluing, I would say you need to continue squaring your insert before you glue this one, because this one's going to cause issues in flight, particularly with big fixed blade broadheads. So where would the issue be in this? Well, the component is mostly internal, so I will look down it. But when I look down it, I can see that it's fine. I can see that there's no bend at the front end of the arrow. The arrow itself is very straight. What this is a simple case of someone not squaring off the end of an insert before gluing this. This was an arrow built by someone at Cabela's, I believe. I mean, this is just a kid's arrow. And clearly they cut it off and glued the insert without thinking about it or spinning it or squaring it, and there's, again, nothing that can be done to resolve this unless you cut it off below the insert and re-glue. And now you might have arrows that develop a little bit of a wobble like this over time. Generally it'll be in the front end, but let's say this was one of my good hunting arrows and now I noticed there was a little bit of wobble on it like this. What I would do is I'll mark this one, and it's just a field point arrow. It will shoot a field point totally fine with that amount of wobble, but when you put a broadhead on it, it's not going to fly perfectly. So I'll mark this as just one of my practice arrows that will only ever shoot field points. It doesn't need to just go to waste. Now when I'm finishing assessing an arrow, I know, for example, that this one was good to go. The knock was fine. It was straight, it spun. The last thing I want to do is bend it like this. So I'll slowly roll it and just lightly bend it as I rotate it. And what I'm doing is feeling for cracks or breaks. The other thing you can do is roll it on your knee. Basically does the exact same thing. But sometimes what will happen is that this carbon can actually be broken. And because, especially on stiffer spine arrows, carbon is so strong, it can spin totally square and look perfectly fine, but you don't know that there's actually a micro break in this. And when you do this bend, it can expose that break, and that's something you need to know. If you ever have an arrow that has a micro break or a sliver in it and you try shooting it, it can explode out of your bow and it's super dangerous. Anytime that I'm shooting and I know my arrows hit in the target, while I'm walking back from the target, I'll do this to all my arrows, because you never want to shoot one that has a break in it. And you can kind of do it all the way up and down. It'll be really obvious when there is a break. You'll either hear it crack, you'll see a splinter pop up, you'll feel one in your hand, which has happened and really sucks. So be careful doing this. But the last thing you want to do is shoot an arrow if it has that kind of issue. So you got to make sure you're always checking for that. So while this was a bit of a long-winded explanation, it doesn't take long to check an arrow. Really all I would do is I would give it the bend test, throw it on a spinner. If it looks good, check the knock. That one's good to go. It's really that quick, and I'll do it with all my arrows probably once every couple of weeks. Like I say, after big shooting sessions, before a hunt, you have to do this. It's really important to know how to inspect an arrow from the back to the front and know where any of the common faults are so that you can assess if an arrow is fit to be in your quiver or not, and if it can be fixed or not. Hope you guys learned something today. Thank you so much for watching.